Hello and welcome. We're going to get started right now. This workshop is entitled A Critical Discussion, Why Not Just Leave, and will be led by Bobbie Becerra. I'm Roman Becerra, and I will be assisting with this workshop. And yes, I am Bobbie's brother. Before we get started, I'll go through some general housekeeping items. First is a reminder of the conference agreements. Take care of yourself, be respectful, place curiosity over judgment. If you can, listen actively, lean into discomfort, and keep an open mind. Also, as a reminder, this workshop is being recorded. This workshop will be a lecture with questions addressed at the end. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Bobbie Becerra is the author of the memoir, Learning to Take It, How I Grew to Accept Abuse. She's a certified domestic violence victims advocate and is a member of the RAIN National Speakers Bureau. Bobbie is a powerful speaker, public speaker, who uses her experience and insights to help give a voice to other survivors and to build a greater understanding of the long-term effects of childhood abuse. And here's Bobbie Becerra.
All right, thank you, Roman. And thank you everyone for being here and giving me a chance to share a little bit about my story. Well, before I get started, I do want to remind everyone that this can be a very difficult topic. So if at any time you feel that you need to step away, then please feel free to do so. Make sure to take care of yourself. During this discussion, I will talk about some specific incidents of abuse. And I understand that the topic of child abuse can be so overwhelming and feel so offensive that it's hard to get past the details of the incident. But that's exactly what I really want to talk about today. What is the impact? What happens to affect life and decisions after the incident is over? As I go through this, none of this is meant to be any kind of advice or any level of judgment about how anyone has dealt with their own personal recovery. This is really just one person's story to try to expand on understanding from one case study. So I was born in an abusive environment. That was just the world that I was born into. And as I grew up, it was something that continued from childhood into adulthood. But even whenever I was in the abuse, from being a young girl all throughout my adulthood, I've always looked for ways to consider different perspectives, always looking for a way out or a different option, something that would hopefully move toward healing. And I can say that over the past 40 years of my own personal recovery, I have definitely seen a change in social attitudes. One of the biggest things that stands out is a difference in how we talk about the victim. I mean, whenever I was a kid, it was very common to blame the victim. Whatever the situation was, there was always some reason to suggest that the victim did something or there was something about that person that made the abuse happen. Today, it is much more common to hear people say it is never the victim's fault. So I think we've made some progress when it comes to changing that script. One of the things, however, that I keep hearing is this question that people regularly have asked me throughout the years. You know, when you were a kid, maybe you didn't have a choice. But as an adult, if things are so bad, then why not just leave? And you know, I've been asked this question so many times, and every single time it came up, it was so difficult for me to hear and to even process or address. And as I started talking to people and trying to dive into why this was so difficult, I started to understand. It's because for many people, this is not a genuine inquiry. This is a judgment disguised as an inquiry. Because as I've talked to people and we follow that thought process, the full question is, why not just leave? Oh, it must be because it's not that bad. Or maybe you like it. Or maybe the truth is, you've just gotten kind of lazy and you're not really ready to change your life. I mean, there are so many judgments around why people live in abuse. It's been so painful for me to process this until I finally just told myself to just stop and take a step back. And I gave myself a chance to provide a genuine answer, which turned out to be this book, Learning to Take It, How I Grew to Accept Abuse. Because my reality is, if I'm going to be honest in answering this question about how I became an abused woman, the first thing I have to talk about is how I was taught to be one when I was still a young girl. So I grew up mostly in Los Angeles with my mom and my brother Roman, who's just a year older than me. And our family had struggles. We were a welfare family, so money was always an issue. Mom had a lot of personal difficulties with her mental health, her physical health. She struggled with alcoholism through her whole life. And we ended up in sort of this strange cycle of moving around a lot. We didn't always know where we were going to stay. And we kept falling into the same space of having abuse follow us no matter what. And it was really a very confusing time because I remember sexual abuse simply being a part of the world. It's one of these things where if you were to ask the average person, when was the first time you heard music? That person might not be able to answer because music's simply part of the world that we live in. And that was very similar to how sexual abuse was just a regular part of my life. The confusing part was while some of the abuse was going on, my mom started talking about how children should be protected. It was probably when I was around 4, it was before I started school, and my mom would start talking to me and my brother. She would call us over and said all the things that a protective parent should say. She talked to us about how adults interact with children. She would openly say that some adults hurt children. There is such a thing as sexual abuse, and it is something that is so damaging that it is critical that we understand that if anything happens, we need to be able to speak up. And she would give us examples. She would say, if someone touches you or if someone says something, it's anything that scares you. And while she's saying that, I'm listening. And in my head, I'm starting to get confused because some of the things that she's bringing up are already part of my life. So I started speaking up. Now, I was a 4-year-old girl, so I didn't have the sophistication to really explain a lot, but I spoke like a 4-year-old girl. And I would say to my mom things like, I don't want to wear pants when this person comes over, because every time he picks me up, his hand goes into my underwear. Or I don't want to kiss this person because the way he kisses me scares me. Or sometimes if someone wanted to spend time with me alone, I would just start crying. And I didn't understand what was happening with this cycle, because every time I spoke up, there was never this space where my mom said it didn't happen, but what she would do is explain to me that I misunderstood. It was something that he didn't mean, or it's something that was a mistake and he's not going to do it again. Whatever it was, there was this constant minimizing or sort of erasing without actually denying what happened. So it was really confusing for me. Then there was the physical violent abuse. Now on that side, things were very, very different. And my mom took a complete opposite position. She would actually openly talk to me and let me know that women get hit, period. There is not a debate on this. And I would start talking to her. I would ask her, I had a lot of freedom to ask questions. And I would ask her why, because it just didn't make sense to me. And she would explain to me that women think with their heads and their hearts. Men think with their fists. She would say over and over that men do not know how to manage life, so the way they manage is with physical force. And that's simply the way the world is. And as I was listening to all of this, I would challenge and I would feel really personally offended. Partially because this is my mother telling me that just because I'm female, I'm simply going to grow up to be a woman who's going to get hit. But the bigger part was this absurd reality that she is saying that men cannot think. When I have my brother, her son, I just never understood how she could so freely share this opinion without any consideration to the reality of our family. So I argued a lot, I would challenge a lot, but the thing that kept coming back was, this is just the way it is. And the truth is, the life that we had validated exactly what her position was. We would go through these cycles where my mom would drink heavily, start dating, get physically hurt, or date someone who would hurt me. And then he would leave, and my mom would go into some strange, almost fearful religious obsession, and then we would go through the cycle again. And there was this time we were in one of these cycles, and my mom was dating, and she brought her date home. And we knew that this was going to be a violent night when we started hearing all the noise. Roman and I were in the bedroom hiding. We were still very young. I was around 5. But this had already happened enough for me and my brother to have our system down. And so we were hiding in the bedroom, and my mom was in the living room with some kind of violent situation going on. And we would listen and wait for the noise to die down. And so finally we hear that he leaves, we hear the door close, and I tell Roman to stay while I go out and see what happened. Because in our family, my mom would say a lot of things to me, but she wouldn't say these things to Roman. So we just understood I would be the one to go out and talk to her. So this night I went out and I look around the room, familiar sights. The room is ripped up and my mom is sitting there crying. But even though this wasn't the first night we went through this, there was something different. I knew that I had seen my mother cry before, but this was the first time I really saw her broken. And I was so mixed with feelings. There was a part of me that was so deeply sad for her. And I just wanted to comfort her and make her feel better. But there was another part of me that was just really angry and confused. I don't understand what's happening. And so I tried to stay quiet and see how she was, but then eventually just asked her very directly, why do we keep living like this? And that is a very difficult and very confronting question for anybody. But for your 5-year-old daughter to be so direct in asking what's happening, I know that this was a very difficult night for both me and my mother. But she recognized that I wasn't going to stop asking. And so she sort of pulled herself together and looked directly at me and said, because that's just the way it is. Back to the same lesson that she's been saying to me every time I've challenged this assumption. This is the way that life is. This is what happens when women get hit. And there was this part of me that felt alone and burdened in a way I didn't know how to hold. And I remember thinking that I wanted to trust and love my mother, but this was absolutely a break. This is one place I did not want to become what my mother is saying. So I felt really overwhelmed, but I listened and we moved on. We continued, started cleaning up the room as usual. And by this time, things have gotten very difficult and I'm feeling so many pressures around what keeps happening. And I'm trying to do what I'm told to do. I'm trying to speak up and I'm asking for help. And I'm thinking about all of these adults that were around me, and I went and directly asked. But again, I was a child, and what I wanted to talk about was this life of abuse. So there's this automatic secrecy and shame that comes with it. So I would start being very careful, but I would go to adults that I trusted and I would say things. I would say things like, I have a secret, but it's a bad secret. Is it okay if I tell you? Or I would say things like, I have a problem, a bad problem that I don't know what to do with. But the thing that kept stifling me, and to be perfectly honest, even as an adult, thinking about it, it really strikes me that so many adults that I went to said the same thing, which was, you're a kid. You have no idea what a problem is. If you think you have a problem now, just wait until you become an adult. That's when the problems start. And I heard this so many times, and I kept feeling like I'm trying to do what I'm supposed to do, but everyone keeps telling me whatever this problem is, it's obviously not that bad. So what I learned was just deal with it. What I learned was people say certain things, but what they actually act upon is different. So I was feeling an incredible amount of pressure and didn't really know how to manage my life. Well, true to our pattern, soon after this period and this confrontation with my mother, we found ourselves in a situation where we didn't have enough money to continue living in our current home. So my mom had to start really thinking about what's next. So in a couple of months, we ended up finding another space and some relief that was much needed when we moved into a new home with a very kind man. It was something that I always considered a very specific gift because what I needed was an example of kindness after going through so many situations, which eventually led to my first suicide attempt. But when we moved, we got to spend several months with this very kind man who really helped me to see that there might be something different, that maybe not every part of life has to be so hurtful. He saw me through my 6th birthday, which was an amazing blessing for me. And then he died a few months after, at the end of the year. When he passed, I remember recognizing that I had a gift in having him in my life. But I was also really frightened because I was afraid of what was going to come next. And I was trying to talk to myself and tell myself that maybe it doesn't have to go back to where we were, because, you know, maybe my mom didn't know that we can live without being hurt. But now we've had so many months with this wonderfully kind man, so maybe now we don't have to go to where we were. Of course, when we moved from his home, we did go back to our regular patterns. We moved to Barstow for a while, and there was something that was so difficult building up between me and my mom. I was vocal in a lot of my objections and my questions, and my mother always gave me room to ask questions. But with those, I was always confronting her in terms of how we were living. And things that were going on just started to really weigh on us. But I was trying to tell myself that things are different, we're going to be okay. Until this one day when I'm with my mother and we hear this knock on the door. And somehow I was immediately terrified when I heard someone approaching. And I was bracing myself for something to happen, and I watched my mom go to the door. And as soon as I saw her open the door and heard this sense in her voice as though she was deeply relieved when she saw this person. When I saw him, what I felt was terror. I did not know what was going to happen, but I knew that there was something that was going to go wrong. I've never known how to really explain it except to say just a deep intuition of what was coming. What I didn't know at the time was this was my mom's deep love, who had just completed his prison sentence when he was convicted of a sex crime against a minor. Of course, my mother welcomed him in, and very soon later, they became married. But you know, he was a little bit different than some of the other abusers. Honestly, most of the men that we were around were very direct. They would simply approach me and start acting inappropriately, or they would get me into a room without anyone and approach me in a different way. This person didn't take that approach. What he did was he started inviting me. He'd just start talking to me. He would invite me into his bedroom after having sex with my mom, and he would talk to me about having sex with her, and then asked me if I wanted to join him. And you know, I knew that this person wasn't so physically threatening at that moment, but there was something about him that just scared me in a way that no one else had. So I told myself to just stay strong. And that was my approach. I knew that I wasn't in control. I knew that my mother would believe anything that he said. And I knew that he loved this really cruel game that he kept playing. So I told myself always to just stay strong, always look at him directly in the eye, never bow my head, never show any fear. And so we would go through these really disturbing episodes where he would start talking to me and laughing at me and asking me to come into his bedroom and asking if I wanted to see him, if I wanted to touch him. And over, I would just stand strong and not show anything, wait until it was over, and then I would walk out. Until finally, he got a little bored and decided it was time to move on. So this time he invited me into the room as usual, and he starts with his invitations as usual, and I still stand as strong as I can. But this time, he says to me that if I don't want to say yes, that he can always invite Roman in. And I understood what was happening here. And I told myself, as I was feeling this overwhelming panic, I kept telling myself, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, whatever happens, just stay strong. So I didn't say anything. I kept looking at him and tried not to cry. And he knew that he got to me in a different kind of way. And so he started laughing and decided it was okay for me to go. So I left that night, but I understood that it was time for me to change my strategy. No matter what, I know that I'm never going to be in control. He's the adult. He has more authority. He has more physical power. But if there's some way I can buy a little time, then I will. So the next time he called me in, I changed my approach. I did not hold my head high. I did not look him directly in the eye. Instead, I bowed my head and I did what I was told. I learned to play the game. I learned to go along to get along, which in some ways worked. Certain parts of his abuse got worse, but he never brought up my brother again. And some of his humiliating games, he started to back off on. So now we're in this really strange space where there's this unspoken agreement that I will go along. But then things started getting really worse. In a very, very uncomfortable, very strange way, he started inviting some of his friends over. And he would bring me out to show off this girl that he has. And it was so confusing because I understood to go along. And I understood going along meant that the abuse would continue, but I also understood that any objection would make it worse. Well, things continued for a little while. And then I think it just got to be too much for my mother. And the day came where my mother decided it was time for him to leave. So we move on from that situation. But in that, there was something that my mother never forgave me for. No matter what details were involved, she lost the love of her life. It was a person that she was afraid of and a person that hurt her daughter, but still, it was something that she always felt a resentment toward me for. So we continue our cycle and we go through more random people who would go through and be with us for a while and continue the same cycle. And then a year or so later, we find ourselves in Ventura. And the thing that's different is we've moved away from this narrative that suggests that children are not supposed to be sexualized. We've stopped that argument completely. And now this cycle of people approaching me continues, but now it's really out in the open. So we would go through these phases, and I'm 8 years old at this time. We would go through these phases where my mom would go through her extreme drinking cycle, she would go through her terrified religious cycles, and then go to dating some very dangerous people. And there was this one night where she found one that she really liked and had him over for dinner and wanted him to meet me and my brother. So we all have dinner, and at the end of the evening, he starts very casually touching me while my mom is clearing the table and cleaning up. And I know what's happening, and I'm really afraid because it's now happening almost directly in front of my mother, where in the past there was at least this game that she didn't know. But we get through this, and he leaves after a little while. And then I'm there with my mom. And we have this really strange argument where after he leaves, she talks to me, you know, in that just exhausted and disappointed voice, and lets me know how upset she is that I had to take this one, because this one she really likes. And she doesn't understand why I keep taking the men that she likes. And I'm, you know, trying to understand what's happening. And to be honest, I'm not even really thinking about any right or wrong judgment. I'm just trying to know the rules. What's going on? What did I do? And, you know, my mom keeps going through and saying that it was something, and I keep arguing my innocence. I didn't do anything, until finally my mom explains to me, maybe it's nothing that I meant to do, but there is something that some women are just born with. And it's something that makes men approach them. It makes men hurt them. And, you know, as she's telling me this, I'm feeling really overwhelmed, and I'm trying to make some sense of this. There's some argument in me that wants to keep fighting, but there's another part of me that says, hold on, whatever's happening, she's really trying to tell me something, so I need to listen. I try to put aside my arguing voice that, first of all, says, I'm 8. When did I become a woman? But okay, put that aside. What is this? And my mom continues to explain to me that these women who are born with this, they have to make a decision. They will either learn to be respectable women and not take other women's men, or they're going to be whores. And I have shown myself to be a whore. And as I'm listening to all of this, I'm trying to hold some balance to receive what she's telling me without losing myself. And I told myself that even if there's a possibility that she's right, what I'm hearing is I need to make a decision not to have children, because I'm seeing what's happening. And my mother is telling me that there are some women that are just born with this thing that makes men hurt them. That means if I ever had children and had a daughter, that means what if she is someone that will get hurt? I'm never going to be able to protect her. This has to end. This whole cycle has to end. That means my decision is I can never be a mother. It was a really difficult realization of this cycle of constant abuse. But it was also a very clear decision for me that the one thing I will do is attempt to end the cycle. And that's an incredible amount of pressure in any situation. But being 8 years old and having so many years of regular abuse, I was almost always in this sense of pressure. And it was starting to show. There were certain symptoms that I was exhibiting that had started a few years earlier. I would start having phases where I was just exhausted. For no apparent reason, I would just almost pass out. I would have fevers, what seemed like out of nowhere. And I would start feeling this incredible depth of sadness or even hopelessness, where I didn't even know how to be present in a space to enjoy some sense of connection because I just couldn't trust the world that I was in. I actually started having these episodes where I would almost lose connection with any of my physical sensation. I didn't recognize the feeling of gravity. I didn't trust my physical environment of what was actually in front of me. And I would go through these phases and I would black out. I was actually diagnosed with epilepsy, but as I've gone through my own recovery, I understand that was most likely a misdiagnosis, and these episodes were more directly related to trauma. But I would go through these phases and I would have these spells, and then I would just sleep for hours. But it was actually my health and a lot of these issues that brought us back to Los Angeles. When we were in Ventura, I was having a lot of these symptoms, and we did not have a doctor that was providing the kind of care that would bring me to wellness. But we knew a doctor in Los Angeles that we trusted. So we left Ventura, came back to LA. And, you know, I had this mixed kind of bag of feelings. Part of me was happy to be back in my hometown. But again, just like every time we moved, I kept wondering what's next. So of course, true to our pattern, very soon I find myself in the same situation. And it just keeps going through these cycles. You know, by this time, I'm not going to school. I basically stopped going to school after 3rd grade, but I'm just trying to keep up with managing whatever's happening in my situation. So we're back in LA, and by the time I'm 10, I am in an adult relationship, or that's what we would call it at the time. Today, what we would say is I was in an abusive relationship. But I was with this person who fell right in place with the world that we were in. And by this time, I found myself in this situation where this scene almost plays out like some, you know, cheap late night movie, where I find myself at a neighbor's home in the basement. And I'm with this person I'm involved with. And things are going to move in a different direction. You know, up until this point, I've been around a lot of violence and I've gone through a lot of sexual abuse, but I've never been directly physically hit without some sexual element. But now this is going to change. And I remember he actually even gave me a bit of a warning. He looked at me and asked me, you know what's going to happen, don't you? And yeah, I knew exactly what was going to happen. But the thing that was so strange about this experience is this wasn't some violent outburst. This was very deliberate. It was a decision that he was going to physically hurt me. It felt like a grooming session to see how I was going to respond. And so we move through. He ends up approaching me. I end up on the ground on my back, and he is above me, pulling his fist back, about to hit me. But before he does, I say very quickly, not my face, it'll bruise. So I want to stop here just for a minute. Because, you know, just a little while ago, I was talking about being in this violent space growing up. But when I was 5, I had enough argument in my head to say, wait a minute, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Whatever anybody says, this is not the way it's supposed to be. So now here I am a few years later. I don't have that voice anymore. I'm not saying, no, this isn't the way it's supposed to go. What I understand is this is very much the way it's supposed to go. And sometimes when I talk about this, sometimes people ask if maybe this was a matter of self-esteem. But to be perfectly honest, in a space of day-to-day survival, esteem is a luxury you just don't have time to think about. It really doesn't matter what I think of myself, because I never imagined I deserved any of this. But what I had to do was live in the reality of the world I was in. And the world I was in, women get hurt. And it doesn't matter that I was still a child. I had to get used to this. So when he does hit me, he does not hit my face, he hits my breast. And I feel myself start to cry, and I'm telling myself not to make sound, just cry quietly, and just, it's gonna be over, it's gonna be over. And finally, when it was, I remember my feeling. I remember I felt accomplished because I knew this was gonna happen. I also knew that it was something that I was gonna have to get used to. This wasn't a one-time thing. So good, I took it, and I didn't humiliate myself by crying out for help that I knew was simply never going to come. This was the world that I had to learn how to be in. So I stayed in this space, and now as we keep going through, a few months later, my mom tells me, I think I was around 11, when my mom decided that she was going to move from our apartment to downtown LA with her boyfriend. And she let me know that I needed to make a decision about what I was going to do with my life. So there wasn't an open invitation that we're moving and I have a home, but she was telling me I had to make a decision about this relationship and what I was going to do. So there was this really weird period where I didn't exactly have a place to live. I was just sort of floating, trying to stay in some connection with my mother, and then staying over with this person. And as I was going through this, I told myself I had to figure something out, because everything that's happening, if I stay with this person, I'm going to lose any sense of who I am. I'm not going to be able to come back from this. And so I kept trying to figure out other options. That was pretty frightening to think about the other options that were available, but I kept looking and kept thinking until this one time he threatened to kill himself if I didn't stay with him. And with everything going on, that was actually the thing that pushed me in a way that said I have to do something else, because there was something so personally wrong with what he said. The idea that he would put his life on me, that I was responsible for, I didn't buy it. And part of it is because I had my own struggles with suicidality. And I knew that it was never up to somebody else to talk me out of something. So I didn't see what he said as anything real. I saw it as a threat. So I decided that I needed to leave. So when I walked away from him, I remember feeling like this was a good thing. This was going to be important for me. But then I walked down toward downtown LA, and I reminded myself that I had to put that away, because what I had to do was figure out a way to ask my mother if it was okay if I could stay with her. So that's what I did. And I moved into this hotel with my mother so that we could attempt to have some kind of life together. So we continued with this strange cycle. I've moved away from this space of abuse, and I'm trying so hard to tell myself that there's a way to break away from this. My mom kept going through her cycles with finding violent men and with drinking, and her whole thing with all of her religious fears. And by this time, I was just working. I would find day jobs. I would do whatever I could, run errands, so I could have a little bit of money so that there would be food in the house and that I could stay fairly close to my mom in case anything really bad happens. And by this time, you know, my brother's dealing with things in his own way. He's found other friends to stay with, so it's mostly me and my mom. And, you know, I always hold on to this space of trying to imagine that we'll be okay. But I feel like things had already gone so far with me and my mother that it felt like there was almost no way to go back. But I kept hoping and kept working and kept doing what I thought I needed to do to manage day to day. And I was able to do that for several months until one day I come back to our room and I see the mother of the person I left showed up to talk to my mom, to have her convince me to go back. And I remember walking into this situation, recognizing the two important women, the most important woman in my life, my mother, were both telling me that whatever I thought I could do on my own, what I really needed to do was to go back. Because his mother said that she was worried he would not survive if I didn't. So again, I knew that this was some strange game. I was very clear that there was nothing about me that was keeping him alive. But what I did recognize was the real question that was in front of me was whether or not I was ever going to have a relationship with my mother. Because the reality is, when I was in a cycle of abuse, my mother knew how to relate to me. She would talk to me. We would play games together. You know, we would listen to music together. But whenever I tried to break away and attempt to create something different, my mother barely spoke to me. She could barely hold any space of my company. So what I understood was the question in front of me was whether or not I was ready to give up my family. And I actually thought about it. I was thinking, I'm working, not going to school, there's got to be something I can do. But the reality was, you know, by this time I was right about 13, and there was simply no way that I could create a life that I could sustain. And I wasn't ready to lose my mother. So for the second time in my life, I bowed my head and I did what I was told. And I went back. And at this point, I understood that my job was make it work, no matter what. That relationship that started when I was so young followed me into my adulthood. And I actually was not able to move away from a life of abuse until after my mother died. So now, as we start looking a little bit closer at just one person's story, a life experience, and we come back to our original question. Maybe there's a part of us that has a different expectation, or maybe we consider asking a different question. So I want to sort of shift gears a little bit and approach the question in a different way. So now we've talked a little bit about just the humanity in the experience and understand that maybe when we really look at this question in depth, there's more than just practical things that we need to address. But there is also practical reasons. So let's go back to the question. In the simplest way, what would an answer be to the question, why not just leave? Well, the truth is, it depends on the person. There are so many considerations. You know, one of the most common reasons is attempting to leave can actually create a stronger sense of danger because sometimes the abuser follows. That's a very real risk. There are also practical issues like financial issues. When I was growing up, I was around a lot of women, particularly Hispanic women, who never worked, and their husbands always worked and always controlled the money. So even though they were still in abusive situations, what they saw was this was the only choice they had. Other considerations are if they're not a legal citizen, what would happen if someone turned them in? What happens if you really make a break and go away? What are you losing? You may actually lose your entire family, which was my biggest concern. There are so many reasons that come up in people's lives. Part of it might be religious, part of it might be sustainability. There's so many things. But one of the things, as we start talking about some of this, we need to start broadening our understanding of what we're actually asking. When we ask someone, why not leave? The position of the question suggests that the solution is just leave a situation or leave a person. But the reality is, for someone in an abusive life to get away, it often means they need to change their entire life. Using my own example as a case study, I start thinking of what would I need to actually be able to break away? And I think that's one of the questions, one of the ways we need to shift the question. Instead of saying, why not leave, more ask what is needed to create a new life. You know, if we were talking about a different topic, if we were talking about changing our lives in different ways, if we said, I'm going to change my career, the first thing we would hear is, okay, wait a minute, if you're going to do that, let's make sure that you're going to be successful. I mean, we have a whole industry, multi-million-dollar industry of books and seminars and recordings of people saying, if you're going to make this change, do what you need to do to make sure it works. And that makes sense because we want people to transition into a life that is going to be good for them. So if that's reasonable when we're looking at changing our jobs, wouldn't it be reasonable to start looking at that when we look at a person in abuse attempting to make a change? So looking at it from that perspective, if we were talking about a career move, if we were opening our own business, we would, in very simple terms, ask at least 4 questions. What's the vision you are trying to create, and do you believe that it can be successful? First thing. Second thing is, do you have the means to actually create the change? Do you have the resources? Do you have what you need? Do you have the money, the time? Third thing, what's your return on the investment? When you put in so much of your life to make this change, how do you know that what you're going to get from it is going to be worth it? Fourth thing, once it's finally in place, how can you actually maintain it? So if we were to look at those simple questions, and if I were to answer based on just my experience, it starts to become really complicated. First question, what's the vision? And do you believe it's possible? My vision would be moving into a space where I can be loved by my family and not be hurt, not be directly abused. That's my vision. Do I believe it's possible? Well, to be honest, for a long time, I wasn't really sure. I mean, I was born into this. I was told it's not supposed to happen. I spoke up, I asked questions, I looked for options, and it was still there. So I wasn't necessarily believing that it was possible, but even if I could hold on to that and say maybe, the next question would be, do you have the resources to make it happen? Now, I was not someone who found myself in a place where I had a concern about my citizenship or didn't have an income. I was really the one who managed all of the money in the house. I was the one that was working. So that part wasn't a concern for me. But what was a concern was, even though I had enough to pay the rent, I didn't exactly have resources to say, okay, I'm going to figure out a way to get my things moved, to get into a new space, to save my job, all of these other things that are needed to actually make the move. I wasn't sure that I had them. And there are public resources with shelters, but that was something I was not prepared to do. So in terms of resources, it was sort of a question. The next question, even if I were able to go through this, what is the return on the investment? This really would have been the absolute stopping point for me. Because even if I could envision what I wanted, even if I could have a space without being hurt, even if I had resources, what it would cost me was my family. My mother would not be in my life. My mother would not be able to look at me. That was simply too high of a cost. So return on investment, that would have been a loss that I wasn't sure, certainly at 13, how I would be able to manage that. Fourth thing, maintenance. This is one of the things that just on a deep personal level is so important to me, because I never hear anybody talk about this. People talk about leaving the situation. Okay, well, it's not like, you're out of a situation and then suddenly everything's okay. After my mom died, I worked really hard to get away from hurtful people and negative elements. What I found was myself in what was a physically safe space, but then everything came. The panic attacks came, the nightmares came, this constant feeling of exhaustion and deep depression set in. So many things were happening in my reaction that I actually had to take a leave of absence. I had to leave my job and just be able to move through some of these results of being in abuse for so many years. This is something that honestly I still deal with. I have been safe in my life for the past 20 years, and I've done a lot of work to be well and to take care of myself. But the truth is, there are still effects that I deal with. I still have extreme nightmares. I still have moments where I'm not sure how to separate myself from some of the pressures that come up. Things like this, we don't really talk about enough. I have some discussions where people will say, someone that I cared about used to be in abuse, but it's been a year already. Why isn't it over? Well, the reality is, if we were looking at a physical injury, we wouldn't say, well, why isn't your leg healed? If you were in an auto accident and your leg was severed, you would never come back and say, well, hasn't it grown back yet? There is a point to simply understand that the kind of psychological and emotional damage that happen with some people who go through abuse is not just a choice to walk away from. There's a recovery process, and it takes an awful lot of work. So whenever we start looking at just these 4 factors and asking, what would it take to create a new life? Again, we're going to go back to our original question and maybe think about it differently. Maybe we can start understanding that it's a different dialogue that we need to have. Which really brings us to kind of this question of, okay, all of these things we need to consider, all of these cycles we need to go through. Well, what can we do now? What can we actually do to create a difference or to support people in our lives or to move towards something that's a greater healing? And I know that sometimes as we go through so much detail and understanding things, it can start feeling overwhelming. But the reality is there are some things that we can do. What we're doing today is one of them. We're talking about it. One of the most damaging parts of my personal experience is the secrecy. The secrecy is what breeds shame and leaves the abuser in control. The more we can start talking about it without shaming the person who went through it, the more we can move toward healing. So just the fact that we're here and we're talking about it and you're listening to this discussion means you're already taking action. The other thing is, yes, let's talk about it. Also listen. Listen in a different way. And again, our discussion today is a perfect example where we started off with something that was a simple question that people just ask. But if we start really listening to survivors' voices, then we understand that there's so much more to really delve into. So as you have these discussions, really listen in a way to understand beyond the practical elements of it. The other thing we can do, educate. Educate ourselves, educate each other. One of the things that I am constantly doing, because I see it as a part of my own healing, is as I have these discussions, as I look at articles, as I look at television shows, I'm always looking at it as a way that I can move through with a different understanding. And that's how I continue to attempt to educate myself. And when people ask me to talk about whatever happened, I welcome the opportunity, because then I get to share something and hopefully give them a different perspective. And as we're going through all of this, one of the most important things to see as a key element is connection. It's one thing to read through facts. It's one thing to go through and sort of absorb statistics. But when it comes to really understanding and actually actively helping survivors get to a new level of healing, it is so critical to simply connect in our humanity. Through all of this, there's never going to be some perfect statement or perfect movement, but what's important is to show up honestly and be open enough to genuinely connect with whoever you're talking with. The last thing I want to really share as sort of a practical approach that I've learned is know your limits. And what I mean is, I feel so fortunate that I'm in a space in my life where after so many years of work, I have enough healing to be able to have this conversation, to be able to openly, publicly talk about some of my lessons and share something that I hope people will be able to receive. But with that, as much as I want to be able to share, I have to recognize where I need to stop. So on a personal level, one of the things that's very difficult for me is law enforcement. And that does not mean that I have any negative opinions about officers or anything else, but it comes down to my personal experience and what I've seen and encountered when I would look to certain legal situations for protection. I simply know that I become overwhelmed. That is not a space where I can openly lead a discussion. Now, I might be able to listen, I might be able to contribute, but I have to be incredibly careful when that topic comes up. So that's just an example. One of the things that's important for me to be able to continue sharing and really expanding on this dialogue is to understand how to protect myself when I'm in certain situations. So that's something I definitely suggest you to consider, is when does it become too much? And then recognize your own signals. So that really brings us to the end of our lecture. I greatly appreciate everyone listening and trying to understand some things a little bit differently. And I know that we did have some questions submitted. So Roman, if you have that in front of you.
Yeah, so there was a lot of questions, mostly in the beginning's comments of appreciation, a lot of thank yous.
Okay.
One specific, Gina, not at all, so very true, and then trying to keep my address from the abuser, and then my mom would bring him over.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, thank you, Gina. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of Gina's comments. I really appreciate your sharing that. It's the reality is sometimes because things are so overwhelming, it starts feeling like this is just in our own individual lives. But the sad truth is a lot of abusers have a lot of the same techniques. I appreciate your sharing that. Thank you, Micah, for your comment. Yeah, I completely understand that sense of disconnection. And that is one of the things that's always my own personal work, is recognizing, having a trusting, intimate space is what I need and what I want to be able to hold on to. And yeah, that's an indicator for me when I start feeling too separate. Yes, Bridget, yes, know your limits, absolutely. Definitely encourage that. And I do think, oh, Tara,
yeah.
Oh, yeah, there are so many people who go through this, and it's so much in actually, once we even talk about all the practicalities and things to consider, making the actual move is just so much. It's hard to verbalize how much work it takes and how much trust it takes to be able to feel like maybe you'll be able to move into a different space. And I do think, we do have a couple of specific questions. Okay, I'm gonna start with Shannon's question. What would be your recommendation when you are working with women who are experiencing domestic violence and they have an outbreak or a trigger in front of a group? Okay. So Shannon, that's a difficult situation, and I can't really give specific advice just because it varies so much by the situation. So what I think I'd like to do is share with you a situation where I was the triggered one. I was the woman who was feeling overwhelmed and out of control. I was actually in a seminar a couple of years ago, so it wasn't that long ago. This was on human trafficking. And I don't know if anyone has heard of this, but there's this film out that's called We Are Evidence. And it is a film that confronts the reality of thousands of unprocessed rape kits. And in this film, they're talking to law enforcement who are saying things that a lot of us have heard that suggest that when women cry rape, it's because they're just, upset about a decision they made. And there's such casual discussion about this mentality. I'm in the audience, and we're in a big conference room with hundreds of people. And as I mentioned earlier, one of my deep sensitivities is around law enforcement. So I'm seeing this film, and I'm not okay. I'm in this space, and I'm at this table with several other survivors around me, and I just fall apart. I just start crying, and not a nice soft cry, one of these loud, terrible, ugly cries. And I remember being in that space, and as frightening and almost as embarrassing as it sounds, to be honest, I really feel that this was one of my most healing experiences, because I was in a space where I was overwhelmed and full of pain and full of fear, and I was not judged. I actually had these amazing women sitting next to me who simply started to touch my shoulder, to tell me it's okay. This was the first space that I had a public expression that I actually felt like I could do this. So the only thing I would say to keep in mind is, as you know, a lot of us know, as we work with so many people who are going through this, you know, she's not making it up. If she's triggered, if she's expressing this, something's going on where she's overwhelmed. So remember that. And, you know, for me, what was important was just permission to have the space to express it. So thank you, Shannon, for that question. I know that's something that a lot of us really have to deal with that. And we have a different question. Christine, did Roman have a similarly toxic experience in life? And how have you played a role in each other's recovery? Okay, Christine, I'm actually really excited you asked that question. I'm going to ask Roman to speak to the first part of the question because, you know, he will speak to his own experience. What I can tell you is, just to the second part of the question, Roman and I have gone through so many ups and downs, you know, in our own personal experiences, personal recovery, and just as a family, just being together and constantly finding this fight to keep going. And this is really kind of an amazing space to be able to hold this reality that I really celebrate, that my brother and I are here and we're actually in our own spaces healed enough to have this dialogue publicly and in front of each other. And we're continuing constantly to really work on embracing and holding each other just as family. So that I really enjoy answering. So thank you for asking that. And Roman, do you want to add anything?
Yes. To answer the question, now the story, you know, I'm recalling, and of course I was there as well, and I remember, of course I went through some of my own traumas and you know, the whole sexual, physical, psychological abuse. 10 for 10 on the aces. And you know, I sort of went the alcohol and drug route, and my recovery more started when I did the longest walk in 2008. And I always credit that because it's not just recovering from my alcohol and drug, it's more of just life in general and trying to recognize myself again. But with our connection with, I mean, like I was talking with Bobbie before this all about our many pacts to stay together, especially when we moved and all that stuff. It's like, okay, we're gonna be here for each other. Mm-hmm. And it's really surreal, and it comes to like where we're at right now, and it's sort of come like complete circle where we're actually together again, once again, in a different space, but in a more healing and good way, moving forward in our own journeys of healing as well. But to come together in this space is really amazing. And I thank you, Bobbie, for doing this. This is tremendous.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. I celebrate everything that Roman and I have been through, you know, bad and good. So thank you very much, Christine, for asking that question. Yes, Melissa, Roman is amazing. You're right.
Yeah.
So thank you, everyone. I think that brings us to a close. Please, if you want to continue this discussion, please reach out. I think my website will be on the Peerpocalypse site. I am at www.bobbiebecerra.com. Yes. Please feel free to reach out. If you go to my website, you can see about the book, you'll see a little bit about my history, and you can see all of my social media handles. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Hmm.